July 24, 1943, Pacific Ocean, west of Truk Lagoon, 0930 hours local time, Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Randall Daspit, 32 years old, United States Naval Academy class of 1933, pressed his eye against the periscope eyepiece aboard USS Tinosa. What he saw should have been the crowning achievement of his naval career. The 19,250-ton Japanese tanker Tonan Maru No. 3 sat motionless in calm seas, its engine room destroyed, black smoke rising from its stack, listing 7 degrees to port. Built in 1938 as a whale factory ship, converted to a tanker in 1942, it was now the largest oiler in the Japanese merchant fleet. Loaded with thousands of tons of desperately needed fuel oil, bound for Japanese forces at Truk, dead in the water, no destroyer escort, no air cover, alone, helpless. Daspit had already fired 15 Mark 14 torpedoes. Each one cost $10,000, the equivalent of $200,000 in today's currency. 13 had struck the tanker's hull with audible metallic thuds that reverberated through Tinosa's sonar equipment. His crew had heard every impact, counted every hit, waited for every explosion. Only 2 had detonated. 13 duds from point-blank range against a stationary target. In his patrol report, Daspit would write words that captured 21 months of American submarine warfare catastrophe. Fired 11th torpedo, hit well aft on port side, made a splash at side of ship, then observed to have taken right turn and jumped clear of water about 100 feet from stern of tanker. Then he added a sentence that revealed his disbelief. I find it hard to convince myself that I saw this. A torpedo that bounced off a ship's hull, turned 90 degrees, and jumped out of the water like a trained dolphin. Physics that shouldn't exist. Engineering that defied explanation. A weapon that cost more than most Americans earned in 20 years. Behaving like a toy. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, 6,000 miles away in climate-controlled offices, had called these weapons the most sophisticated torpedoes ever designed by any nation. Revolutionary magnetic exploder technology, state-of-the-art gyroscope guidance systems, precision depth-keeping mechanisms, the pinnacle of naval weapons engineering. American submarine commanders, the men actually firing these weapons in combat, the men whose lives depended on them working, had different names for them. Tin fish, duds, junk, pieces of shit, the most expensive doorstops in naval history. In 18 months of war, from December 7, 1941 to August 1943, American submarines had fired 1,442 Mark 14 torpedoes in combat operations across the Pacific theater. They had sunk 109 Japanese ships, totaling 41,171 tons, according to post-war Japanese records. The Navy's official claims during the war had been substantially higher, 211 ships totaling 1.3 million tons. But the Japanese records told the truth. 90% of claimed sinkings hadn't happened. Torpedoes that commanders reported as hits had been duds or misses. Ships reported as sunk had limped into port, damaged but afloat. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, German U-boats firing roughly the same number of torpedoes had destroyed more than 400 Allied ships, totaling over 2.5 million tons. More than 4 times the American success rate, with the same technology level, the same tactical challenges, the same convoy escort threats. German torpedoes worked. American torpedoes didn't. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. American submariners were taking the same risks as their German counterparts, facing the same depth charges that could crush a submarine hull like a beer can, enduring the same weeks of patrol in cramped, stinking steel tubes, stalking the same heavily defended convoys, making the same life-or-death approach calculations. But they were returning to Pearl Harbor, Fremantle and Brisbane with empty bags and stories that no one in Washington wanted to hear. Through 1943, the entire Pacific submarine force had expended 14,748 torpedoes against 4,112 Japanese ships. They sank 1,305 of them. That's 11.3 torpedoes per ship sunk, 11 torpedoes at $10,000 each to sink a single enemy vessel, $113,000 per sinking, $2.3 million in today's currency. German U-boat commander Karl Dönitz complained bitterly about his crews using 2 torpedoes to sink one ship. American submarine commanders were using more than 11, and the Bureau of Ordnance was blaming them for incompetence, because the problem, according to Washington, wasn't the weapons. It was the crews, the commanders, the tactics, everything except the torpedo itself. Each Mark 14 torpedo represented the equivalent of $200,000 in today's money. 20 feet and 6 inches of steam-powered precision engineering. Diameter, 21 inches. Weight, 3,280 pounds. Warhead, 680 pounds of Torpex explosive, 50% more powerful than TNT. Propulsion, compressed air and alcohol fuel driving a radial piston engine producing 450 horsepower. Maximum speed, 46 knots, faster than most surface ships could run. Range, 4,500 yards at maximum speed, 9,000 yards at reduced speed settings. Guidance, a sophisticated gyroscope system that could be preset to run straight or execute turning maneuvers. Depth control, a hydrostatic pendulum mechanism designed to maintain preset running depth regardless of sea conditions. Exploder, the revolutionary Mark 6, featuring both magnetic influence and contact detonation modes. On paper, it was a masterpiece of naval engineering, the product of 7 years of development work from 1931 to 1938. Testing at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island. Design refinements by the Navy's most experienced ordnance engineers. Integration of cutting-edge technology that no other Navy possessed. In Washington briefing rooms and Newport laboratories, the Mark 14 looked like the weapon that would win the Pacific War. In combat, hundreds of miles from land, with Japanese destroyers hunting and depth charges exploding, it was something else entirely. The weapon's development had occurred during the Great Depression, when military budgets were slashed to the bone, when the Navy couldn't afford to paint barracks, let alone conduct extensive weapons testing, when every dollar spent on live-fire exercises was a dollar not spent on keeping ships maintained and sailors fed, when institutional pride became more important than rigorous verification. In 7 years of development, the Mark 14 torpedo had been live-fired exactly twice, 2 test firings, for a weapon that would become the primary armament of the entire Pacific submarine fleet. One of those 2 tests failed. The torpedo ran erratically and didn't detonate properly. The Bureau of Ordnance noted the failure, analyzed the data, and decided not to conduct a 3rd test. Cost too much, time too valuable. The weapon looked good on paper. That was sufficient. The weapon used a hydrostatic depth control mechanism, essentially a pressure-sensing device connected to control vanes, that had never been tested with actual combat warheads containing 680 pounds of high explosive. It had only been tested with practice warheads filled with water to approximate weight. No one considered that Torpex explosive might have different density characteristics than water. No one ran comparison tests. No one thought it mattered. The Mark 14 featured a magnetic influence exploder, the Mark 6, that represented a revolutionary breakthrough in weapons technology. The concept was elegant. A ship's steel hull distorts Earth's magnetic field. A sensor in the torpedo's nose could detect that distortion. At the optimal moment, when the torpedo passed beneath the ship's keel where there was no armor, the magnetic exploder would trigger. The 680-pound warhead would detonate directly underneath the ship. The explosive force would create a massive gas bubble. The bubble would expand, lifting the ship's midsection out of the water. The ship's own weight would break its back. Catastrophic structural failure. One torpedo, one kill. Beautiful theory. But the magnetic exploder had been calibrated exclusively in Newport, Rhode Island. Latitude 4149 degrees north. Earth's magnetic field strength at that latitude, approximately 57,000 nanoteslas. Pacific combat zones ranged from the equator to 40 degrees north. Magnetic field strengths in those zones varied from 30,000 to 55,000 nanoteslas. Field declination angles differed by 15 to 20 degrees. Horizontal and vertical components of magnetic fields behaved completely differently. Every one of these variations affected the Mark VI exploder's trigger sensitivity. None of them had been tested. None of them had been calibrated for. The Bureau of Ordnance assumed Earth's magnetic field was uniform. It's not. The contact exploder, the backup system designed to trigger if the magnetic exploder failed, contained a firing pin mechanism that was a direct descendant of the World War I era Mark III exploder. A heavy firing pin mounted in a brass guide with spring resistance. When the torpedo struck a target, impact deceleration was supposed to drive the pin rearward against the spring, compressing it until the pin struck a primer cap that would detonate the main warhead. Simple mechanical design, proven in the previous war, tested extensively in laboratory conditions. The problem was that the Mark XIV torpedo travelled at 46 knots, substantially faster than World War I torpedoes had run. Higher speed meant higher impact forces. Higher impact forces meant more abrupt deceleration. More abrupt deceleration meant the firing pin's inertia would keep it moving forward while the torpedo body stopped. The pin would crush itself against the guide before it could strike the primer. Physics 101. No one at the Bureau of Ordnance had thought to test it. 3 critical defects. 3 separate subsystems that didn't work under combat conditions. Depth mechanism. Untested with combat loads. Magnetic exploder. Uncalibrated for Pacific magnetic fields. Contact exploder. Unable to function at design speeds. None discovered until men were dying at sea. None fixed until operational commanders took matters into their own hands. All dismissed by the Bureau of Ordnance as crew incompetence rather than engineering failures. The Bureau of Ordnance had placed the Mark XIV into production in 1938 with supreme confidence. The Naval Torpedo Station at Newport, Rhode Island, had been designated in 1923 as the sole designer, developer, builder and tester of torpedoes in the United States. No independent verification. No competing designs, no external oversight. The foxes guarding the henhouse. By 1943, production had ramped up to 70 torpedoes per day, manufactured at 3 facilities. American Can Company, better known for making tin cans for soup and vegetables, became the primary contractor. International Harvester, the farm equipment manufacturer, joined production in 1942. Pontiac Motor Division added capacity in 1943. The irony wasn't lost on submarine crews. The company that made soup cans was building their primary weapon. Tin fish took on a darker, more sardonic meaning. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The Japanese attack that pulled America into war also revealed the first hints of catastrophe. In the chaos and destruction, no one paid attention to a small detail. The Mark XIV torpedo hadn't been combat tested. Not once, not ever. Peacetime firing exercises used practice warheads. Live fire tests against actual ship hulls had been deemed too expensive. The Navy was about to discover what that decision cost. December 14th, 1941, 1 week after Pearl Harbor. USS Seawolf, SS-197, Sargo-class submarine, encountered a Japanese freighter near the Philippines. Commander Frederick Burdett Warder, a career submarine officer, set up the approach by the book. Range 1-200 yards, angle optimal 90-degree broadside, sea state calm, target 4,000-ton freighter, speed 8 knots, unescorted. Perfect conditions. Warder fired 8 Mark 14 torpedoes. His crew heard 7 of them running, 7 white wakes racing toward the target. 30 seconds to impact. 7 missed entirely. The 8th struck the freighter's hull with a sound Warder would never forget. A dull, metallic clang, like someone hitting a steel drum with a hammer. No explosion. The torpedo bounced off. The freighter continued on its way. Warder stared through his periscope in disbelief. 8 torpedoes. Perfect setup. 0 damage. He filed a detailed report when Seawolf returned to port. The Bureau of Ordnance's response was swift and unequivocal. Commander Warder had failed to execute a proper approach. The torpedoes were fine. The problem was crew incompetence. In the first 3 months of war, December 1941 through February 1942, American submarines fired 97 Mark 14 torpedoes at enemy shipping across the Pacific. They sank 3 ships, 3 out of 97, a success rate of 3.1%. Submarine commanders began filing reports, detailed, methodical reports. Torpedoes running too deep, passing beneath targets without detonating. Premature explosions occurring hundreds of yards before reaching targets. Duds on perfect hits, leaving dents in enemy hulls but causing no damage. Erratic runs. Torpedoes porpoising up and down, surfacing mid-run. Circular runs. Torpedoes turning back toward the firing submarine. The Bureau of Ordnance reviewed these reports with institutional skepticism, bordering on contempt. Rear Admiral William Henry Purnell Blandy, Chief of Buord, had overseen the Mark 14's development. His reputation was tied to this weapon. His career depended on it working. He had a standard response to every complaint. The torpedoes were fine. The problem was crew incompetence, poor approach angles. Inadequate maintenance, bad seamanship, insufficient training, everything except the weapon. April 1, 1942, USS Sculpin, SS-191, encountered an unescorted Japanese cargo ship in perfect visibility off the Philippines. Commander Lucius Henry Chappell, experienced submarine commander, set up the approach. Range 1,000 yards, sea state, flat calm, target speed 7 knots, angle on bow 90 degrees. The textbook shot. Chappell fired 3 Mark 14 torpedoes. Through his periscope, he watched all 3 wake tracks converge on the target. Perfect alignment. Perfect timing. All 3 torpedoes passed harmlessly beneath the cargo ship. The only thing that exploded was Captain Chappell. By July 1942, Sculpin had fired 45 Mark 14 torpedoes on multiple patrols. Results: 7 enemy ships damaged, not sunk. Damaged. 7 ships out of 45 torpedoes, 15% hit rate, and even those hits mostly failed to sink their targets. USS Greenling, SS-217, provided the most dramatic example of Mark 14 failure. Commander Henry Chester Bruton encountered a 6,000-ton Japanese freighter on July 5, 1942. Weather, clear. Visibility, excellent. Sea state, calm. Target, unescorted, making 8 knots. Range, 1,500 yards. Bruton executed a textbook approach. He fired 4 Mark 14 torpedoes. Through his periscope, he watched all 4 wakes converge on the target. Perfect alignment. All 4 torpedoes passed harmlessly beneath the freighter. 4 misses from an ideal position. Commander Bruton did something unprecedented. He went ballistic with rage. He ordered Greenling to surface in full view of the enemy freighter. Broad daylight, potential suicide. He ran past the Japanese ship at flank speed, exposing his submarine to any weapons the freighter might have had. Set up for another attack from 1,350 yards, in bright moonlight, where any Japanese aircraft or warship could spot him. He didn't care anymore. He fired 2 more torpedoes. First torpedo, set at 18 feet depth, ran under the target, exploded on the beach behind the freighter. Second torpedo, set at 8 feet depth, appeared to detonate against the transport's side. 2 more torpedoes, set at 4 feet depth. Both failed to explode. By now, Japanese gunners on the freighter had opened fire. 4-inch shells splashing around Greenling's exposed conning tower. Machine gun tracers streaking across the water. Bruton withdrew under fire, diving to escape depth. He reloaded his tubes, not with Mark 14s, with Mark 10 torpedoes. The Mark 10 was the World War I-era weapon the Mark 14 was supposed to replace, an obsolete design from 1915. Longer reload time, shorter range, slower speed, but it worked. Bruton surfaced again, set up another approach, fired 2 Mark 10 torpedoes. Both ran hot, straight and normal, submariner terminology for perfect performance. Both hit the freighter, both exploded. The Japanese ship broke in half and sank in 4 minutes. The old torpedo was 2 for 2. The new torpedo was 0 for 6. Commander Bruton's patrol report was scathing. He documented every shot, every miss, every setup detail. He demanded immediate investigation. The Bureau of Ordnance's response: Commander Bruton had violated proper firing procedures and would be counselled on correct torpedo handling. But the complaints kept mounting from every submarine command across the Pacific. Too many reports from too many experienced commanders. Too many perfect setups yielding 0 results. The pattern was undeniable to everyone except the Bureau of Ordnance. May 1942. Rear Admiral Charles Andrews Lockwood became Commander, Submarines, Southwest Pacific Area, based in Fremantle, Western Australia. Lockwood, 52 years old, had commanded submarines since 1914, starting with USS A2, the Navy's second submarine. He had held every submarine command position from division commander to squadron commander. He knew submarines. He knew weapons. He knew his commanders. And he knew when someone was lying to him. When Lockwood read the war diaries from his submarine commanders, detailed action reports from men risking their lives, he saw a pattern the Bureau of Ordnance refused to acknowledge. Perfect approaches, ideal firing positions, experienced commanders, well-trained crews, and failure after failure after failure. The common denominator wasn't the crews, it was the Mark 14 torpedo. Lockwood did something unprecedented. He ordered his own test, independent verification, without waiting for Bureau of Ordnance approval, without requesting permission from Washington. He purchased a 500-foot fishing net using his own money, $500 out of his personal bank account, because he knew Buord would never authorize the expense. June 20th, 1942, Frenchman Bay, Albany, Western Australia. 800 Mark 14 torpedoes had already been fired in combat operations since Pearl Harbor. More than a year's production from Newport Torpedo Station. $8 million worth of weapons. Lockwood was about to prove they were defective. USS Skipjack, commanded by Commander James Willard Coe, fired a single Mark 14 torpedo with an exercise head at the fishing net. Distance, 850 yards. Depth setting, 10 feet. The torpedo was painted bright orange for visibility. Coe, Lockwood, and a dozen officers watched through binoculars as the torpedo ran toward the net. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Impact. The torpedo pierced the net, not at 10 feet depth, at 25 feet depth, 15 feet deeper than set. The evidence was visible, measurable, photographed, undeniable. Commander James Fife, Jr., Lockwood's Chief of Staff, wasn't satisfied. The next day, June 21st, he conducted 2 more test shots. First torpedo, set at 10 feet, ran at 21 feet. Second torpedo, set at 10 feet, ran at 22 feet. Average deviation, 11 feet deeper than set. Lockwood prepared a detailed report, photographs of the net tears, measurements of actual depths, calculations proving the systematic error, recommendations for immediate correction. He sent the report to the Bureau of Ordnance by encrypted cable. Buord's response arrived 3 days later. The submarine commanders weren't trimming the torpedoes properly. The nets weren't positioned correctly. The measurements were flawed. The torpedoes were fine. The problem was user error, not weapons failure. Lockwood's test was invalid. Admiral Ernest Joseph King, Chief of Naval Operations, read Lockwood's report. King, 63 years old, had commanded submarines himself during World War I. He understood submarine warfare. He understood weapons systems. He understood bureaucratic obstruction when he saw it. King sent an eyes-only message to Rear Admiral Blandy at the Bureau of Ordnance. The message contained 3 words that would become famous in Navy circles. "Light a blowtorch." King personally ordered Buord to conduct their own tests, not in Newport where conditions could be controlled, in actual ocean conditions, with actual combat-loaded torpedoes, against actual measurement systems. August 1st, 1942, 8 months into the war. The Bureau of Ordnance finally conceded the Mark 14 torpedo ran deep. 6 weeks later, on September 18th, they admitted the depth control mechanism had been improperly designed and tested. The problem was embarrassingly simple. The Mark 14 had been tested exclusively with practice warheads filled with water to approximate weight. Combat warheads contain 680 pounds of Torpex explosive. Torpex has a specific gravity of 1.81. Water has a specific gravity of 1.0. The combat warhead was 81% heavier per unit volume than the practice warhead. The extra weight pushed the torpedo's nose down. Deeper running depth. Every torpedo. Every shot. Every time. First-year engineering students could have predicted this, but the Bureau of Ordnance hadn't tested it. By August 1942, the depth problem was supposedly fixed. Submarines were instructed to set their torpedoes to run at least 10 feet shallower than desired impact depth. Crude fix, but it worked. Sort of. Submarines began getting more hits. The torpedoes were finally running at correct depths, but the number of sinkings didn't rise. Now the torpedoes were hitting targets at the correct depth and still not exploding. Problem 2. The magnetic exploder. The Mark VI magnetic influence exploder represented the Navy's most closely guarded secret, classified higher than most cryptography systems. The theory behind it was sound. A ship's steel hull contains ferrous metal. Ferrous metal distorts Earth's magnetic field. The distortion is detectable. A magnetic sensor in the torpedo's nose could measure that distortion. When the torpedo passed beneath the ship's keel, the magnetic field would reach maximum distortion. The exploder would trigger. The 680-pound warhead would detonate directly underneath the ship where there was no armor. The explosive force would create a massive gas bubble expanding at supersonic speed. The bubble would lift the ship's midsection out of the water. The ship's own weight, acting on its unsupported ends, would break its back. Catastrophic structural failure. 1 torpedo, 1 kill. The theory was beautiful. The reality was catastrophic. But the Mark VI was hypersensitive to any magnetic disturbance. a torpedo passing beneath a ship's hull at 30 to 40 feet depth. The ship's hull created magnetic disturbances extending 60 to 80 feet from the hull. The exploder would sense the disturbance and trigger. Too early. Hundreds of yards before reaching the optimal detonation point, the torpedo would explode harmlessly in open water. The target would sail away undamaged. The submarine crew would hear an explosion and think they'd scored a hit. They hadn't. April 9, 1943, Lieutenant Commander John Aloysius Scott, commanding USS Tunney, SS-282, found himself in a position submarine commanders dream about but rarely experience. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, Hio, 24,040 tons, commissioned 1942, Junyo, 24,040 tons, commissioned 1942, Taiyo, 17,130 tons, commissioned 1941. Total displacement, 66 or 110 tons of the Japanese carrier fleet. Range, 880 yards, less than half a mile. Perfect firing position, calm seas. Excellent visibility. No escort screen between Tunney and the carriers. Scott fired all 10 tubes, 4 stern tubes, 6 bow tubes, every torpedo Tunney carried. He heard 7 explosions. Through his periscope, Scott counted the detonations. 7 splashes, 7 columns of water. His crew cheered. 7 hits on 3 carriers. Possibly 2 carriers sunk. At minimum, heavy damage to all 3. A devastating blow to Japanese naval aviation. But through his periscope, Scott watched something impossible. All 3 carriers maintained speed. No reduction in velocity. No course change. No list. No smoke, except normal stack exhaust. Hio steamed past at 18 knots. Junyo followed at 18 knots. Taiyo brought up the rear at 17 knots. All 3 carriers proceeding on course as if nothing had happened. 7 explosions. 0 damage. Scott filed his patrol report in stunned disbelief. Post-war Japanese intelligence revealed what actually happened. All 7 Mark 14 torpedoes had exploded prematurely. The magnetic exploder had triggered when the torpedoes were still 200 to 400 yards from the carriers, too far away to cause any damage. The explosions Scott heard were his own torpedoes destroying themselves in open water. 0 hits, 0 damage, from a perfect setup that should have crippled the Japanese carrier force. The pattern repeated across the Pacific. April 10, 1943. USS Pompano SS-181 attacked Japanese aircraft carrier Shokaku. Commander Lewis Parks fired 6 torpedoes from 2,500 yards, at least 3 premature explosions. The carrier sailed away undamaged. June 10, 1943. USS Trigger SS-237 fired 6 torpedoes at Japanese carrier Hio from 1,200 yards. Commander Roy Stanley Benson observed the results through his periscope. 2 torpedoes missed. 1 exploded prematurely. 1 was a dud, hit but didn't explode. 2 hit and detonated properly. The carrier was damaged but made it to Kure Naval Arsenal for repairs. Hio would return to service and participate in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944. A carrier that should have been sunk in June 1943 was still fighting a year later. Submarine commanders estimated that 10% of their Mark 14 torpedoes exploded prematurely. Bureau of Ordnance Statistics claimed only 2%. The difference was methodology. BUORD counted only confirmed premature explosions, ones that could be verified through multiple sources. Submarine commanders counted every time they heard an explosion that produced no apparent damage. Which number was accurate? Post-war analysis of Japanese records proved the submarine commanders were right. February 1943. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood was promoted to Commander, Submarines, Pacific Fleet. He moved from Fremantle, Australia to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, the largest submarine command in the US Navy, and the torpedo problems moved with him. Lockwood decided to force the issue. He flew to Washington in spring 1943. Direct confrontation with the Bureau of Ordnance. No more polite reports, no more diplomatic cables. Face to face. At the Submarine Officers' Conference, with dozens of senior naval officers present, Lockwood delivered a statement that became legendary in submarine service. If the Bureau of Ordnance can't provide us with torpedoes that will hit and explode, then for God's sake, get the Bureau of Ships to design a boat hook with which we can rip the plates off a target's side. The room went silent. Rear Admiral William Henry Purnell Blandy, Lockwood's old friend from their time together at the Naval Academy, and now Chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, sat in the front row. His face turned red. After the conference, Blandy confronted Lockwood in his office. "I don't know whether it's part of your mission to discredit the Bureau of Ordnance, but you seem to be doing a pretty good job of it." Lockwood's response was measured, but lethal. "Well, Spike, if anything I have said will get the Bureau off its duff and get some action, I will feel that my trip has not been wasted." The two men stared at each other. Old friends, now adversaries. One defending his weapon, one defending his men. June 24, 1943. Admiral Nimitz ordered all Pacific Fleet submarines to deactivate the magnetic influence feature of the Mark VI exploder. Use contact detonation only. The revolutionary magnetic exploder, the Navy's most closely guarded secret, was officially abandoned after 18 months of war, after hundreds of failed attacks, after thousands of premature explosions. The Bureau of Ordnance's miracle weapon was declared unsuitable for combat. July 7, 1943. USS Tinosa, SS-283, departed Midway Atoll for her second war patrol. Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit commanded. Gato-class submarine, commissioned January 1943, length 311 feet, displacement 1,125 tons surfaced, 2,124 tons submerged. Armament 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 6 forward, 4 aft, 24 Mark 14 torpedoes. Crew 7 officers, 73 enlisted. Tinosa carried a full load of the newest production batch of Mark 14 torpedoes. The depth problem had been fixed. The magnetic exploders had been deactivated per Admiral Nimitz's June 24th order. Contact detonation only. The Bureau of Ordnance assured everyone the remaining problems were solved. The torpedoes would work. This time. Tinosa prowled the shipping lanes between Borneo and Truk for 17 days. Empty ocean. No targets. Long days of surface patrol, charging batteries, maintaining systems. Long nights submerged, conserving power, searching with sonar. Submarine warfare is 99% boredom punctuated by moments of absolute terror. July 24, 1943, day 17 of patrol, 1600 hours. Tinosa's surface search radar detected a contact. Bearing 315 degrees, range 18,000 yards, 9 nautical miles. A thin trail of grey smoke on the horizon. Daspit ordered Tinosa to submerge, diving klaxon. Ah-oh-ga, 30 seconds from surface to periscope depth. Daspit raised the periscope, swung it to bearing 315. One look. His heart rate doubled. A tanker. Massive. The largest he'd ever seen. Making approximately 10 knots on a steady course. No destroyer escort visible. No air cover. Alone. Daspit identified the target from recognition photos. Tonan Maru No. 3, built 1938 as the whale factory ship Tonan Maru. Gross tonnage 90,210 tons. Length 539 feet. Beam 72 feet. Converted to a tanker in 1942 when Japan's oil crisis became critical. Now the largest oiler in the Japanese merchant fleet, capable of carrying 14,000 tons of fuel oil. The ship Daspit was looking at represented months of Japanese fuel production. Enough oil to keep a carrier task force operational for weeks. This wasn't just a target. This was a strategic prize. Daspit set up a textbook approach. Range 4,000 yards. Speed Tinosa running submerged at 3 knots. Angle on bow 40 degrees starboard. Target course steady. Target speed 10 knots. The fire control solution was perfect. 0928 hours. Daspit gave the order. Fire 1, torpedo 1 away. Fire 2, torpedo 2 away. Fire 3, torpedo 3 away. Fire 4, torpedo 4 away. 4. Mark 14 torpedoes running hot, straight and normal toward Tonan Maru, steam propulsion engines humming, gyroscopes spinning, depth set at 10 feet, speed 46 knots, all 4 wakes visible through the periscope. White lines converging on the target, 30 seconds to impact. The sonar man called out, 4 impacts, sir. 4 distinct thuds, metal striking metal. But no explosions, no detonations, just thuds. Daspit stared through the periscope. The tanker turned to port. Increased speed to 15 knots, smoke pouring from its stack. Running. Daspit cursed. 4 hits, 4 duds. He ordered Tinosa to surface. Full chase. 4 diesel engines at maximum power. 20 knots surface speed. The hunt was on. Tinosa chased Tonan Maru throughout the night, July 24th to July 25th. Diesel engines roaring, spray flying over the bridge. The tanker maintained 15 knots. Tinosa slowly closed the distance. Daspit's torpedo crew worked through the night, inspecting every remaining fish, checking firing pins, verifying exploders, testing gyroscopes. Everything appeared perfect. Maintenance logs showed no defects. Every torpedo checked out. Dawn, July 25th, ordered 8:20 hours. Tinosa had regained attack position. Range 2,000 yards. Daspit approached from the starboard quarter. He fired 2 torpedoes. Torpedo 5, torpedo 6. Both wakes ran true. Impact. Explosion. First torpedo hit Tonan Maru's engine room. Second torpedo hit the stern. Both detonated. The muted rumble echoed through Tinosa's hull. The crew cheered. Finally, smoke and flame erupted from the tanker. Its engine room exploded. The ship coasted to a stop, listed 7 degrees to port, settled by the stern. Dead in the water. Now Daspit had time. All the time in the world. He could set up the perfect attack. The attack every submarine commander was taught at New London Submarine School, the textbook approach that guaranteed success. Daspit positioned Tinosa at 1,000 yards from Tonan Maru's port side. Perpendicular approach, 90-degree angle on bow, dead broadside, the perfect shot. The 680-pound Torpex warhead would blast a massive hole in the hull below the waterline. 2 or 3 torpedoes would break the ship's back. 4 would guarantee the kill. Daspit had 16 torpedoes remaining, more than enough. 0930 hours. Fire 7. Torpedo 7 away. Daspit watched through the periscope. The white wake ran straight and true. Perfect track. Perfect speed. Perfect alignment. Impact. A splash against the tanker's hull. Water erupting. But no explosion, no detonation, just a splash. And a dull thud heard through Tinosa's sonar. Daspit blinked, looked again. The tanker was still there, still listing, still floating, undamaged except for the 2 previous hits. He fired again. Fire 8! Torpedo 8 away. Perfect track. Impact. Splash. Thud. No explosion. Fire 9! Impact, splash, thud, no explosion. Fire 10, impact, splash, thud, no explosion. Japanese crew members were now visible on Tonan Maru's deck, pointing at the torpedo wakes. They could see them coming, white lines approaching, impact, splash, and nothing. The tanker's crew began firing, machine guns, 4-inch deck gun, shells splashing around Tinosa's periscope. Bullets ricocheting off the water. Daspit kept firing. Fire 11! Torpedo 11 hit well aft on the port side, made the usual splash. Then something impossible happened. The torpedo, instead of sinking or exploding, made a right-angle turn, 90 degrees to starboard. It jumped clear of the water about 100 feet from the tanker's stern, breached like a whale, arced through the air, splashed back down, and sank. Daspit watched the entire sequence through his periscope. He would later write in his patrol report, "I find it hard to convince myself that I saw this." But he had. A torpedo that hit a ship's hull, bounced off, turned 90 degrees, and jumped out of the water. Physics that shouldn't exist. Behavior that defied explanation. A weapon gone completely insane. Daspit made a decision. He would fire every remaining torpedo except one. He would save one torpedo for examination at Pearl Harbor. Proof of the defect. Evidence that couldn't be dismissed. He kept firing. Fire 12, impact, splash, no explosion. Fire 13, impact, splash, no explosion. Fire 14, impact, splash, no explosion. Fire 15, impact, splash, no explosion. 11:31 hours, 2 hours and 33 minutes of firing torpedoes at a stationary target from point-blank range. 11 torpedoes since the tanker stopped. Every single one a confirmed hit. 0 explosions. Then Tinosa's radar operator called out, "Surface contact, bearing 270, range 15,000 yards, high-speed screw beats." A Japanese destroyer, coming fast, 35 knots, 7 nautical miles away, 20 minutes to arrival, bone in her teeth, coming to kill Tinosa. Daspit had no choice. "Take her down, make your depth 300 feet. Rig for depth charge attack." Tinosa dove, ballast tanks flooding, bow planes angled down, stern planes angled down. The submarine descended through 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet. The pressure hull creaked. Depth gauges showed 310 feet, deeper than the design test depth of 300 feet. Above them, the destroyer's screws passed overhead, thrashing the water, creating turbulence. The sound was clearly audible through Tinosa's hull without sonar. Thump, 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 thump. Then silence. The destroyer was positioning for a depth charge run. Wham! First depth charge exploded 200 yards away. The shockwave hit Tinosa like a hammer. Light bulbs shattered. Dust fell from the overhead. Men grabbed stanchions for support. Wham! Wham! 2 more depth charges. Closer. The submarine shook. Cork insulation fell from the bulkheads. Gauges cracked. A hydraulic line burst in the forward torpedo room. High-pressure oil spraying. Tinosa's crew waited. Silent. Barely breathing. Praying. 15 more depth charges exploded over the next hour. None close enough to cause catastrophic damage. The destroyer finally gave up and returned to escort the crippled tanker. 1,357 hours. Tinosa eased back to periscope depth. Daspit raised the scope. Tonan Maru was still afloat. The destroyer was alongside, preparing to take the tanker under tow. Daspit watched his prize, the largest tanker in the Japanese fleet, being saved. 15 torpedoes fired, 13 confirmed hits, 2 explosions, 11 duds. Daspit filed a radio report to subpack, requested that another submarine be dispatched to finish off Tonan Maru. The reply came at 2220 hours. Return to Pearl Harbor immediately. Bring remaining torpedo for analysis. August 4th, 1943. Tinosa surfaced at Pearl Harbor. Daspit set a course directly to the submarine piers. Before the lines were secured, Daspit was already walking toward subpack headquarters, Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood's office. Daspit entered without knocking. Lockwood looked up from his desk, saw the expression on Daspit's face. Lockwood would later write about that moment. "I expected a torrent of cuss words, damning me. The Bureau of Ordnance. the Newport torpedo station, and the base torpedo shop, and I couldn't have blamed him. 19,000-ton tankers don't grow on trees. I think Dan was so furious as to be practically speechless. But Daspit didn't rage. His voice was quiet, controlled, deadly. He simply told the story. 15 torpedoes, 13 hits confirmed by sound, 2 explosions, 11 duds, from point-blank range against a stationary target for 2.5 hours, with perfect firing solutions. 1 torpedo that bounced off the hull and jumped out of the water. Japanese crew members pointing at incoming torpedoes and not even trying to abandon ship because they knew the torpedoes wouldn't explode. Lockwood ordered the remaining Mark 14 torpedo, number 16, delivered to the Pearl Harbor submarine-based torpedo shop. Immediate inspection, complete teardown. Every component analyzed. The inspection found nothing wrong. Perfect working order. Every component within specifications. The firing pin moved freely. The spring had proper tension. The explosive train was intact. The Torpex was properly loaded. The gyroscope functioned perfectly. Everything checked out, which meant the problem wasn't this particular torpedo. The problem wasn't this particular batch. The problem was the design itself. Lockwood called in Commander Charles Bowers Mommsen, Swede, Mommsen, 42 years old, one of the Navy's most brilliant officers, the inventor of the Mommsen-Lung submarine escape device that had saved lives from sunken submarines, a man who understood both engineering and combat reality. Lockwood gave Mommsen a direct order: find the problem, fix it, no matter what it takes, no matter who it embarrasses, no matter what the Bureau of Ordnance says. Find out why these torpedoes aren't exploding. Mommsen began systematic testing, not in controlled laboratory conditions, in the field. Real-world tests. He selected a remote cliff face on the Hawaiian coast, solid rock, vertical wall, accessible by sea. He loaded 3 Mark 14 torpedoes onto a tender, set them to run at shallow depth, aimed them at the cliff, fired. First torpedo, hit the cliff, exploded. Second torpedo, hit the cliff, exploded. Third torpedo, hit the cliff, no explosion. Dud. 1 out of 3 failures. 33% dud rate. Against a cliff that wasn't moving. That had 0 armour. That presented a perfectly solid impact surface. Mommsen tried a different test. He rigged a crane at the Pearl Harbor submarine base, loaded Mark 14 warheads, live warheads with exploders installed, lifted them 50 feet in the air, dropped them onto concrete pads to simulate impact. First drop, explosion. Second drop, explosion. Third drop, no explosion, dud. Fourth drop, explosion. Fifth drop, no explosion, dud. 2 out of 5 failures, 40% dud rate. Mommsen began analysing the contact exploder mechanism in detail. The Mark 6 Mod 1 contact exploder used a firing pin that was a direct descendant of the World War I era Mark 3 design. The pin was mounted vertically in a brass guide tube. A spring provided resistance. When the torpedo struck a target, impact deceleration was supposed to overcome the spring resistance. The pin would drive rearward, strike a primer cap. Primer would ignite. Ignition would propagate through an explosive train to the main Torpex warhead. Simple design, mechanical, reliable in World War I. But there was a problem. The firing pin was made of tool steel, dense, heavy, mass, approximately 24 grams. The Mark 14 torpedo impacted at 46 knots, 78 feet per second. Impact deceleration, approximately 50 to 100 G-forces, depending on target hardness and impact angle. At a perfect 90-degree broadside hit against a ship's steel hull, deceleration was nearly instantaneous. The torpedo body stopped, but the firing pin's inertia kept it moving forward. Forward, not backward. The pin crushed itself against the forward end of the guide tube, before the spring could drive it backward, before it could strike the primer. The harder the impact, the worse the failure. Perfect hits produced perfect duds. At 45-degree oblique angles, the impact was less abrupt. The torpedo skidded along the hull before deceleration. The firing pin had time to move backward. About 50% of torpedoes at 45 degrees exploded. 50% were duds. At shallow oblique angles below 30 degrees, the torpedoes worked reliably. Glancing blows allowed the firing pin mechanism to function as designed. The Bureau of Ordnance had created a weapon that worked best when used incorrectly. Everything submarine commanders had been taught at New London Submarine School was wrong. The textbook 90-degree broadside shot, the perfect attack, was the exact scenario that caused failure. The oblique angles that were considered less optimal because they reduced the effective impact area were actually the only angles at which the torpedo worked. Mumson's solution was elegantly simple. Replace the heavy tool steel firing pin with a lighter alloy, reduce mass, reduce inertia. Allow the pin to respond more quickly to impact deceleration. The alloy had to be strong enough to strike the primer with sufficient force, but light enough to be driven backward by the spring before inertia destroyed it. Mumson found the perfect material in an unexpected place. Salvaged propeller blades from Japanese aircraft shot down at Pearl Harbor during the December 7th attack. Japanese aviation engineers had developed an aluminum-based alloy with precisely the right characteristics: strong, light, corrosion-resistant, perfect for firing pins. Japanese engineering would fix American torpedoes. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Mumson supervised the production of new firing pins. Testing began immediately. Drop tests, 100% success rate. Cliff tests, 100% success rate. Angle tests, 90-degree impacts now worked. 45-degree impacts now worked. Even shallow angle impacts continued to work. The fix was complete. September 1943, 21 months after Pearl Harbor. The first Mark 14 torpedoes with Mumson's modified contact exploders were delivered to operational submarines. Finally, after 1,442 torpedoes fired with a 3% sinking rate, after 14,748 torpedoes expended with an 11 torpedo per sinking average, after hundreds of perfect attacks that yielded nothing, after dozens of Japanese ships that should have been sunk but escaped, after 53 American submarines lost, 20 of them before October 1943, after hundreds of American lives, the Mark 14 torpedo finally worked. The official naval history would record it this way. After 21 months of war, the three major defects of the Mark 14 torpedo had at last been isolated. Each defect had been discovered and fixed in the field, always over the stubborn opposition of the Bureau of Ordnance. Three defects: depth mechanism, fixed by Rear Admiral Lockwood's net tests in Australia, forcing Buord to admit improper design and testing. Magnetic exploder, fixed by Admiral Nimitz's direct order to deactivate the magnetic influence feature after catastrophic failure rates. Contact exploder, fixed by Commander Mumson's field tests and firing pin modification after Daspit's Tonan Maru disaster. Every single fix developed and implemented by operational submarine forces. Not one fix originated at the Bureau of Ordnance. Not one fix came from Newport Torpedo Station. Every problem was discovered by men in combat. Every solution was developed by officers in the field. Every fix was implemented over Buord's objections. October 1943, the fixed Mark 14 entered widespread combat use. The results were immediate and dramatic. USS Haddock, SS-231, sank 2 Japanese ships with 4 torpedo hits, 4 torpedoes fired, 4 explosions, 2 ships sunk, 100% hit rate, 100% detonation rate. Finally, 1944, US submarines fired over 6,000 torpedoes, predominantly Mark 14s with Momsen's fixed exploders. They sank approximately 2.2 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping, a quadrupling from 1943 totals. Not because submarine tactics improved, not because crews became more skilled, because the torpedoes actually exploded when they hit targets. The same submarines, the same commanders, the same crews. The same tactics, but weapons that actually worked, and the results spoke for themselves. By August 1945, American submarines had sunk 1,278 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling 5,053 491 tons, 55% of Japan's total merchant marine capacity, 55%. More than half the entire Japanese merchant fleet, gone. Oil tankers that never reached the home islands. Japanese carriers sitting in port because there was no fuel. Japanese aircraft grounded because there was no aviation fuel. Troop transports that never reinforced Pacific garrisons. Japanese soldiers starving on bypassed islands because no supplies arrived. Freighters carrying raw materials that never reached Japanese factories. The American submarine force, once armed with reliable torpedoes, became the most effective anti-shipping force in naval history. More effective than the German U-boat fleet at its peak, more effective than Allied strategic bombing, more effective than surface naval engagements. American submarines with working torpedoes destroyed Japan's ability to wage war. But the torpedo scandal revealed something darker than defective weapons. It exposed institutional arrogance that cost lives. It revealed bureaucratic stubbornness that prolonged the war. It demonstrated that reputation could matter more than combat effectiveness, that pride could override evidence, that institutional power could silence operational experience. The Bureau of Ordnance had developed the Mark 14 torpedo in secret, compartmentalized development, no independent verification, no competing designs, no external oversight. No realistic testing, no operational input. When problems emerged, Buord blamed the users. Submarine commanders were incompetent. Crews were poorly trained. Tactics were wrong. Maintenance was inadequate. Everything except the weapon itself. For 21 months, the Bureau of Ordnance defended the indefensible, dismissed operational reports, rejected field tests, refused to acknowledge problems, fought every fix, resisted every change, until evidence became overwhelming, until pressure from the very top forced their hand, until men like Lockwood, Nimitz, King, Fife, and Momsen made it impossible to deny reality any longer. The Bureau of Ordnance never apologized. They never acknowledged that submarine commanders had been right all along. They never admitted that institutional pride had cost American lives. They simply implemented the fixes that operational forces had developed, claimed credit for solving problems they had created, and moved on. But the submariners remembered. They remembered firing perfect spreads that didn't explode. They remembered watching enemy ships sail away. They remembered the frustration of risking their lives for weapons that didn't work. They remembered the anger at being blamed for failures that weren't their fault. They remembered the deaths of submarines that might have survived if their weapons had worked. And they remembered what happened when the Mark 14 finally worked, when tin fish became killing machines, when American submarines turned the Pacific into a graveyard for Japanese shipping, when the weapon that had been a joke became a war-winning tool. The transformation took 21 months, 800 faulty torpedoes fired before anyone admitted there was a problem. 14,000 more torpedoes expended while fighting bureaucratic resistance. 53 submarines lost, 20 before the fixes were implemented, hundreds of American lives, thousands of Japanese ships that should have been sunk in 1942 but escaped, strategic opportunities missed, tactical victories foregone, all because the Bureau of Ordnance valued its reputation more than combat effectiveness. But the submariners never stopped fighting, never stopped reporting problems, never stopped testing, never stopped demanding weapons that worked, never stopped documenting failures, never stopped advocating for their crews, and eventually they got what they needed. Not because Washington granted it, but because they fixed it themselves. The Mark 14 torpedo proved that warfare isn't just about sophisticated technology. It's about realistic testing, honest assessment, willingness to admit mistakes, listening to the people who actually use the weapons, trusting combat experience over peacetime assumptions, valuing lives over reputation. The men who commanded American submarines in World War II faced the enemy with courage, but for 21 months they also faced their own navy's institutional arrogance. They fought not just Japanese destroyers, but American bureaucrats. They battled not just enemy convoys, but their own chain of command. They struggled not just with combat stress, but with the knowledge that their own weapons were defective and their own leadership wouldn't admit it. They fought both battles, and they won both battles, not because Washington finally listened, but because they forced Washington to listen, by documenting every failure, by conducting their own tests, by refusing to accept excuses, by going over heads when necessary, by risking their careers to save their crews. By war's end, the tin fish had become the weapon it was always supposed to be: reliable, deadly, devastating, war-winning. The Japanese merchant marine never recovered from what American submarines did to them in 1944 and 1945. Oil stopped flowing from the Dutch East Indies. Reinforcements stopped arriving at Pacific garrisons. Raw materials stopped reaching Japanese factories. Japan's industrial base withered. Its island garrisons starved. Its carriers sat in port for lack of fuel. All because submarines finally had torpedoes that exploded when they were supposed to. All because operational commanders fixed what the Bureau of Ordnance had broken. All because submariners refused to accept failure. The torpedo scandal of 1941-1943 remains one of the US Navy's greatest embarrassments, a preventable disaster, a failure of leadership, a triumph of institutional arrogance over combat reality, a case study in how bureaucracy can kill. But it also remains a testament to the submariners who refused to accept failure, who kept fighting even when their weapons didn't work, who kept documenting even when their reports were dismissed, who kept testing even when ordered to stop, who kept demanding better even when told to shut up, until they got it. The Bureau of Ordnance laughed at the submarine commanders' complaints, called their reports exaggerated, called them incompetent, called them liars, dismissed their evidence, rejected their tests, defended the indefensible, until reality became undeniable. They laughed at the complaints about tin torpedoes, called them sophisticated weapons that couldn't possibly be defective, called them revolutionary advances in naval warfare, called them the finest torpedoes ever designed, until those same torpedoes, finally fixed by the people who actually used them, sank an entire merchant fleet and changed the course of the Pacific War. Not because the Bureau of Ordnance built a great weapon, but because submariners refused to accept a bad one, 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 to accept a